Eve, the Shibshan Fulcha, and Shaw and you, Smisha Jim Gibney, Tommy Awal, Féile and Phobail. By much can't we and housing issue August and you, Tommy Councillor Eoin O'Broin. First of all, I would like to welcome you all to Féile and Phobail 2020. This year, due to the virus restrictions, Féile and Phobail is online. So Eoin O'Broin, TD, has very kindly joined us, and we're going to speak about the significance of the issue of housing in the election in February past in the South, and its impact on that election. And Eoin will speak in general terms about the housing issue itself and its place in the political system in the south of Ireland. And last year, Eoin published a book called Home, Why Public Housing is the Answer. And Eoin O'Broin is TD for Dublin Midwest and Sinn Féin spokesperson on housing, planning and local government. He is an author of a book on Basque nationalism and the radical Basque youth movements, and Sinn Féin and the politics of left republicanism, and of course this recent book, Home, Why Public Housing is the Answer. And I would now like to invite Eoin to make a presentation to you for a few moments.
Thanks very much, Jim, and as always it's a real pleasure to be here in Belfast. It's kind of a second home to me, so whenever I get the chance to come up, I always take it. Look, what I'd like to do is maybe just talk a little bit about why our housing system is in the mess that it's in. And it's not just a feature of the housing system in the south of Ireland or in Ireland generally. This is a global housing crisis. If you look at big cities pretty much everywhere, whether they're in the wealthy north or the emerging or less wealthy south, cities are in crisis. Housing systems right across the world are failing to meet the needs of ever-growing numbers of people. And I suppose one of the reasons why I decided to write the book, which I published last year, was to try and fully understand how do we get into the mess that we're in. Because if we're going to put together credible policies to take us out of this dysfunctional housing system and meet people's housing needs, which is, of course, one of the central objectives of Sinn Féin, North and South, we have to understand the problem. So without, I suppose, completely undermining the need for people to buy the book and read it, let me give you a kind of a quick summary of some of the arguments. I mean, the first thing is as I was saying, housing systems all over the world are in crisis. And they've been in crisis for a long time. This isn't something that's just emerged since the great crash of 2008 or the austerity that was introduced in the years after that, although all of that made it worse. Really, to understand our housing crisis, you have to look at changes that happened, particularly in the advanced economies from the 1980s onwards. And if you look at the South just for the moment, before the 1980s, the vast majority of people had their housing needs met. Either A, because successive governments invested heavily in good quality public housing by local authorities for working people. They didn't always build enough, and they didn't always build it as consistently as they needed, but it was a major part of the Free State project. But also government spent huge amounts of money on long-term low-interest loans and grants for people to build and buy their own homes. So my grandparents' generation, for example, whether they were working class in council homes or slightly better off and buying their own homes, the state guaranteed access to secure and affordable accommodation for most. As it was always the case, there were particular groups of people who were discriminated against: travellers, people with disabilities, and often people who had other issues going on in their lives, like addiction or mental health. But pretty much by the 1970s, one of the few successes of the Free State was that it had met the housing needs of the vast majority of people, cleared the slums, built good quality public housing, and supported people to build and buy their own. But what happens in the 1980s, and particularly at the end of the 1980s, is a number of fundamental changes. They began in the US, then came to Britain, and then came to Ireland. And the first was a change in the nature of how societies funded home ownership. People who are old enough to remember back in the 70s and early 80s, you didn't go to your high street bank to get a mortgage to buy a home. In fact, banks weren't allowed under law to lend in that way. There were some building societies, but they were very, very restrictive. And what that very restrictive credit policy did was it meant you didn't have lots of speculative investment in land and property. Starting in the US and then Britain and then under Fianna Fáil in the 80s in the South, that all changed. So they liberalised credit lending rules and they legalised high street banks entering into the mortgage market. Now, at the time, that was presented as a good thing. It was going to free up credit. It was going to make home ownership more available. But in fact, what it actually did was it replaced long-term, low-cost state finance, which is what people had before, with much, much more expensive high street finance. And of course, as all of this mortgage finance washed into the system, the consequence was it pushed up land prices and pushed up house prices. So starting at the end of the 1980s and then into the 1990s, house prices started to shoot up dramatically. There's a wonderful graph that I reference in the book from an English economist called Joshua Ryan Collins, and he looks at house prices in the OECD over the 20th century. It's a very, very simple graph. Pretty much from the start of the 20th century right through to the mid and the end of the 80s, house prices were generally static, in line with wages, in line with the economy. Then by the end of the 1980s, house prices just start to shoot up dramatically, but wages don't. So, of course, we arrive in the 1990s, and again, this isn't a phenomenon just specific to the south of Ireland. It happened in the north a little bit later. It happened in Britain and elsewhere. Is that increasingly working families were having to borrow huge sums of money to buy houses which were very modest in size, but very excessive in price. So academics call that the financialisation of home ownership. And of course, it led to a huge affordability crisis. It was also one of the primary causes of the Celtic Tiger, of the bubble, and the ultimate crash. And of course, that left very significant numbers of households in mortgage distress, mortgage repossession, etc. Alongside that, the other big change that successive Irish governments made in the south from the late 1980s to 1990s is they dramatically reduced direct state investment in public housing. So whereas right up until 1987, 88, the state would have been building 8,000, 9,000 real council homes every year. By the end of the 80s, it was 800 or 900. And very, very low levels of social housing output continued through the 90s and noughties. That pushed up local authority housing waiting lists. So people by the end of the 90s, early noughties could be waiting 10 years plus for a council house. But it also changed the nature of council housing. Council housing used to be housing for working people of a variety of incomes, of a variety of professions. But once you started having less and less council housing became housing for the very, very poor, for people who weren't in work, for people who had complex needs, for people emerging from homelessness, from low-income one-parent families. So that idea of council housing as a bad thing, as a poor option, became firmly embedded in the public psyche. Again, the academics have a nice long-winded word for it, residualization, but it's the idea of, rather than the state guaranteeing good quality public housing for wide ranges of working people, small amounts of public housing for the very, very poor. That then meant more and more people had to move into the private rental sector. Young working families or young working single people who couldn't afford to buy. They couldn't save for deposit or their income wasn't big enough to get a mortgage. And all of those people waiting for local authority housing. So you have this dramatic growth of the private rental sector. Poorly regulated. Now, the private rental sector in the south is better regulated than it is in the north and indeed in Britain and the US. But a trebling in the size of the private rental sector with a high degree of insecurity. High degree of price volatility, prices can go up and down, and what they kind of call the kind of precarious nature of private rental. We're kind of used to talking about precariousness and insecurity in the labour market, 0 hours contracts, low pay. Same thing happened in housing. And you have a situation where today in our big cities, all over the world, there's a whole generation of young people, some of them on really good wages, some of them in good jobs, and they simply can't afford to rent or buy homes. So, of course, when the crash happened, all of that got worse. When severe austerity was imposed and cuts to public spending and capital investment in public housing, all of that got worse. And really one of the features of the last 4 years of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil has been to do very little to change that fundamental shape. So what we've seen is the affordability crisis has grown and grown. Today, for example, in Dublin, to get a standard 2-bed rental apartment, it's €2,000. Right? That's a phenomenal amount of money. Elsewhere in the state, it's €1,200 or €1,300 to rent. The average price to buy a starter home in Dublin, not a palace, but a standard 2-bedroom starter home, is €370,000. And in fact, in the south of Dublin, where it's land prices are more expensive, it can be 400 to 500,000 euros for a standard 80 or 90 square metre, 2 or 3 bedroom semi-detached home. Apartments are even more expensive. You go to some of the suburbs around Dundrum and Dublin, and to buy a standard apartment now will cost you 400 to 500,000 euros. So of course that means is this whole generation of young people are locked out from renting or buying. But also you think of people who maybe have had relationship breakup, and they're in their late 40s or their 50s. One partner and the kids get to keep the family home. Well, where does the other partner go, even on an income of 40, 50 or 60,000 euros? And they're kind of looking at retirement approaching. They're never getting a mortgage to buy a place. They're looking at very, very high rents. So the housing insecurity doesn't just affect low-income families waiting for social housing, doesn't just affect young singles and couples looking to rent or buy. There's an increasing number of people in their late 40s, mid-50s, who also need access to affordable housing and who are finding it very difficult. One of the big features of the southern housing crisis in recent years has been a dramatic increase in homelessness. I mean, I worked for Focus Ireland for a few years in Dublin when I left Belfast in 2006. And we would have always had about 3,000-4,000 homeless people, very, very few families with children, mainly single people, and mainly people who had other complex triggers in their life: addiction, domestic violence, relationship breakdown, mental health. But over the period of Fine Gael in office from 2011 to 2016, child homelessness, family homelessness increased by a shocking 400%. We ended up having over 10,000 adults and children in emergency accommodation. And many of those families could spend 2 or 3 years in emergency accommodation with all of the physical and psychological and developmental impacts that has, particularly on young children. Those figures have fallen slightly under COVID, but there's still a big concern about all of that. And I suppose if you were to try and characterise the two fundamental problems in how the housing system in the south and in many overdeveloped countries has evolved, it's two fundamental problems. Housing is viewed as a commodity rather than a home being seen as a public good, and that's infecting public policy. And then government over-relying on the private sector, whether it's private developers or private landlords, to meet social and affordable housing need. And of course, you put those two things together and you get the kind of crisis that we have. So the big question, of course, is there an alternative? And the good news is, yes, there is. And there is a growing policy consensus, not just in the South, but globally from a range of advocacy organisations, housing rights campaign groups, progressive political parties, academics, who are all broadly saying the kinds of things that Sinn Féin has been saying for quite a long time about how you fix this dysfunctional system. And at the centre of it is two core principles. If our problem with the current system is housing as the commodity, and an over-reliance on the private sector, then the flip side of that is the solution, which is to start to see housing as a fundamental human right, a fundamental human good, which is essential for people to be able to flourish in modern society. And then in response to that, for the state to accept that it has a major role through the delivery of public housing on public land to ensure people have access to good quality, secure and affordable accommodation. So the specific proposals I outline in the book, and it's one of those books where about half of it is devoted to the solutions. They're not my ideas, they're not Sinn Féin's ideas. This is an ongoing global conversation about how to fix broken housing systems. It can be summarised as follows. The first is we need governments all over the world, and particularly here, to start investing heavily in the direct provision of public housing. And when I say public housing, I have a slightly broader sense than what people currently understand as social housing or council housing. And what we're talking about is good quality mixed income housing estates of social rented housing. So that's housing that is subsidised for very low income families. Affordable cost rental housing, there's no subsidy, but the people renting it are paying the economic cost rather than the market speculative cost. And what we call affordable leasehold housing, where people buy the homes, but they don't get to buy the land underneath. They can live in it, the houses, they can pass them on to their kids. But if they ever want to sell those homes, they have to sell them within the affordable housing system to other families within the income brackets for that. So they can never sell them into the private sector and make a big windfall gain. And that idea of what we call mixed income, mixed use housing communities, really, really good quality housing for a range of income groups. But within those housing developments, people would have access to economic opportunity, educational opportunity, cultural and sporting amenity, good quality public transport. In, I suppose, kind of denser cities where it's much easier to walk and get the bus and the train to wherever you want to go. We're not all sprawled out in suburbs dependent on cars and that kind of thing, which means not only do people have better quality housing, better quality services, you're also contributing to combating climate change, because if we want to deal with carbon emissions, we have to change the way in which we live and work and move around our cities. The other thing I also talk about in the book is buildings are part of our physical environment. Mm-hmm. They affect how we see and experience the city. So we don't just need more and better quality homes. They have to be designed really well. There was a period in time, particularly in London and in Britain, where in the 60s and 70s, the very, very best buildings were public buildings. Right? The idea that the public sector should invest in good quality, beautiful design to enhance people's experience of the city. And that kind of got lost somewhere along the way. And there's again a movement in the south. You're beginning to see really interesting architects trying to combine really good quality housing for the people who live there, best possible energy efficiency standards to reduce fuel poverty and contribute to combating climate change. But they're also beautiful. They also create attractive streets and attractive cities, etc. And I suppose that's one of the things we're also arguing. And alongside that, something that's quite a new concept, but rather than in a kind of a patrician way, the state building houses and just pushing people into them, including the people who will make up those communities in not just the design, but the decision-making of how their cities and their communities are built, a kind of a participative planning process, which is something we're talking about more and more. So I suppose at the core of our housing policy is that idea of substantial state intervention to good quality public homes, to build good quality cities, but one which is ultimately good for the people who are going to live there and populate those communities. I suppose a couple of other things which are really important to remember is under our plans in the south at the moment, we want half of all new homes delivered to be public homes. So at the moment, there's a need for about 35,000 to 40,000 new homes produced every year. Some of those could be older homes that have fallen out of stock that could be renovated and returned to use. That would be a very, very large commitment in terms of capital investment. It would also mean that whereas today we have about 9% of our housing stock is public, we want to move to a situation over a decade where 30% will be public. One of the interesting things about the crash in 2008 is those housing systems that best weathered the housing element of the recession of past 2008 were those housing systems that had much larger non-market sections to the housing system. Singapore was one, Germany was another, Austria was another, because that meant the state had a much greater ability to absorb the shock in people's housing needs. We also need to better regulate the private rental sector, and that means in the first instance, because rents are so high, banning rent increases for a minimum of 3 years. And then after that, linking rents to the economy, to wages, to consumer price index. So rents would go up and go down in line with wages and the general movement of the economy. Ultimately, that's better not just for tenants, but for landlords, because it gives everybody security over the long term. We also need far greater security of tenure. It's back to the old land lease principle of the 3 Fs and the idea of what we call tenancies of indefinite duration. You take out a lease in a property, so long as you pay your rent and you abide by the rules and you don't engage in antisocial behaviour, you should be able to stay there as long as you need to. This idea that landlords can serve notice to quit because they want to move into the property or have family members move in, or those days of a kind of unprofessional, accidental landlord system have to go. And at the same time, we have to support and help professionalise our landlord system. There's nothing wrong with landlords who provide a good quality service being able to make a reasonable return on that service, so long as tenants get fair rents and security of tenure. And we also have to find ways of ending the boom and bust in the property market. And the two key areas there, and these are probably areas that don't get enough debate, is going back to a tighter regulation of credit into the property market, and in turn properly regulating land. Because one of the real reasons why housing becomes so expensive during the boom is because land is a very unusual commodity. It's finite. You can't produce more land. In fact, land is a commodity there's always less of. So if you're an investor and you want to invest your capital, the surest bet you can invest in is in land, because while the property might dip tomorrow, it will always recover and it will always increase. So there's really interesting debates. And again, in Britain, progressive economists, a lot of them have been working in and around Jeremy Corbyn and some of the London universities, producing really innovative ideas about how to regulate credit, limit land speculation, and do all of that in a way that moderates the price of housing. And then the big thing, of course, is we need to end long-term homelessness. There will always be situations where people lose their home. But what a society can do, and Finland is the world leader in this, is it can dramatically reduce the number of people who become homeless and the length of time they're homeless. So you can effectively eliminate long-term homelessness and the need to sleep rough. But that means government needs to have the political will to say, within the lifetime of a government, we're going to end long-term homelessness, we're going to end the need to sleep rough, we're going to end the use of dormitory-style accommodation, and ensure that where people do have housing crises, there's good quality emergency accommodation available, but they're in there for very, very short periods of time before they're moved on to appropriate accommodation. I suppose the last thing I just want to say is that's all very nice and well.
Sure.
But how are we going to make it happen? And in the last number of years, there's been really interesting things happening in the South in terms of the building of a broad-based coalition around housing rights. Mm-hmm. We saw it during the Right to Water movement, where you had trade unions, community-based organisations, and progressive parties preventing that very, very regressive tax and double tax on water. We saw it with repeal, we saw it with marriage equality. And we began to see the beginnings of it in 2019 around housing. There's a thing called the Housing and Homeless Coalition, political parties, trade unions, housing rights organisations, academics. That then morphed into a bigger thing called Raise the Roof, led by the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. And while we kind of struggled a bit to get the kind of numbers that we might have got mobilised in the referenda, you could very clearly see that in the general elections, it really had an impact in terms of politicising people around housing. That has to continue. And it has to continue in a way that mobilises people outside the political institutions, with progressive politicians inside the political institutions. One, to hold this new government of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Greens to account, to demonstrate at all times there are real, credible and costed alternatives. And if and when the new government doesn't deliver, and I don't think it will on the basis of the programme for government, that a growing number of people out there realise, well, the only way we can deliver real change is increase the number of progressive TDs, and particularly Sinn Féin TDs. So when we have the next election, we're able to form a truly progressive government. So while there's a lot of concern and nervousness at the moment, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, about whether or not we're going to see any change in housing, there is also the beginning of a return to optimism to say progressive parties in the Dáil are stronger than we've ever been. And the public has become mobilised among a number of issues, housing being one of the key issues. And Sinn Féin now has a responsibility, along with other progressive parties and players, to rekindle that activism and ensure over the next number of weeks, months and years, we place housing firmly at the centre of the political agenda so people realise change is still possible, and to get involved and support campaigns, including those led by Sinn Féin, to deliver the kind of housing system that increasing numbers of working people not only need, but rightly deserve.
Okay, well, gone look at Sinn, and that was a very comprehensive explanation of where the issue of housing sits at an international and at a national level as well. And then if we just reduce it down, if you like, to the situation with respect to the southern state. And I would just like you to address two things. You talked about the optimism that there is now in southern society, and some of that optimism is reflected in the changed nature of the representation in the Dáil and in the Seanad, from a situation where you now have Sinn Féin as the lead party in the state, and certainly one of the three big power blocks in the institution of the Dáil itself. So housing was one of the decisive issues in the February general election and in the rise of Sinn Féin. Can you explain this?
Yeah, I think what happened was we'd spent a lot of time over the last number of years on areas including health, on housing, on childcare, not only criticising the outgoing Fine Gael-led government supported by Fianna Fáil, but trying to convince people that there were credible solutions. Opposition for opposition's sake will only take you so far. And in general, people who are having difficulties in their lives, they want stuff fixed. Yeah. Right? They want things to improve. Anger is a valuable emotion, but only if it translates into a kind of a determination to improve the quality of people's lives. And while in the latter half of 2019, some of us were a bit nervous because despite the fact there was lots of efforts to try and mobilise around housing, the Sinn Féin was doing more work around housing policy. We were tabling legislation and motions in the Dáil. There were mobilisations and protests out on the street by ourselves. and Raise the Roof and other groups, there didn't seem to be any indication in the opinion polls that it was moving beyond the kind of activist circles, if you like. Then we got into the general election campaign and everything changed. And very, very quickly we could see something fundamental had shifted. So that rather than this being a contest between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, with the smaller parties kind of scrambling to see who would be the power broker, very early on, once we saw the early opinion polls, what you were actually getting is this was a contest between Fine Gael and Sinn Féin, between the party of failure in terms of tackling these big ticket items, and not just social issues like health and housing, but for example, the failure to advance the United Ireland, the failure to engage in progressive international policies around Palestine and other issues, and Sinn Féin. And the electoral contest was really, really interesting. Fianna Fáil started to get squeezed. And while we all had our various theories about that, in the election we just focused on consolidating it. But if you go back and look at the RTE and academic exit poll data, really substantial exit poll from the February election, it showed that housing was the second biggest issue of public concern. It was the single biggest issue of public concern under people under the age of 35. And Sinn Féin was getting a disproportionate number of those voters. And that reflected what we were getting on the doors. I was canvassing in places, and you'd be talking to, say, a couple in their late 40s, early 50s. And next thing, the 20-year-old would bound down the stairs and tell us that him and all his friends were voting for the first time because they were fed up of being in their mid-20s and living at home because they couldn't afford to rent or buy. We were knocking on the doors of retired people in relatively comfortable accommodation situations who traditionally might have voted for Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, but telling us they were so fed up of the fact that their kids and grandkids couldn't get housed that they were going to give Sinn Féin a chance, that they heard what we were saying on issues like health and housing and childcare. And one of the things we heard a lot was, well, you couldn't do any worse than them. It's now time to give Sinn Féin a chance. But what they were also saying to us on the doors, and this was reflected in the immediate post-election conversations we were having on the street, is we're giving you this chance, but don't let us down. Right? Because we're fed up of people telling us they were going to deliver change and not. That then fed into this really incredible sense of optimism immediately after elections. I've never felt anything like it in, maybe the only time I felt anything like it was in the years, immediately after the ceasefires here and again after the Belfast Agreement in 98, that sense of tangible sense that real improvements in people's lives were now going to take place. I'd be walking up Grafton Street going into the Dáil and people would be stopping me on the street, something that would never have happened before, and wishing you well and saying, we really want you to succeed. We then did that round of public meetings, you remember, we did one in Newry and Dublin, and I remember going into the one in Cork. And I've never seen not just so many people in a room, but an energy and excitement and anticipation that things were now possible that weren't before. And look, COVID-19 has changed all of that temporarily. And obviously when the virus hit and people started to die, people's immediate concern is their family's welfare, their own welfare, their community's welfare. And then you had the economic shock of layoffs. And so obviously that has tempered a lot of that immediate post-election enthusiasm. But I think as people begin to see the exit out of COVID, people are now returning to those other issues to say, okay, we need to get out of COVID. We need to make sure that the virus doesn't return to a second wave. We need to obey all of the public health recommendations and measures. But there's big outstanding issues that still have to be tackled. And, again, the recent opinion polls have shown housing and health are still the two biggest issues of public concern in the South. I think the challenge for those of us who are, I suppose we call ourselves the pro-change political parties in the Oireachtas and the campaigners on the ground, is to convince people that despite the disappointment that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have kind of carved up power for themselves again, albeit through the poor judgment of the Green Party, that the battle isn't over and we need to get back to organising and mobilising in and outside the institutions so that whenever the next election happens, in a week, in a month, in a year, in 2 years, we can make the kinds of advances that we almost made in February of this year, and then we can have a truly progressive, as Mary Lou called it, a left Republican Green government that can tackle all of these big outstanding issues.
We now have a situation where the new government is in place. It's a coalition government led by the Taoiseach Micheál Martin for Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Green Party. And is there any indications of a change of policy in the programme for government in relation to housing that was pursued by the last government?
No, absolutely not. I mean, one of the things that's really clear when you read the housing section of the programme is it is virtually the Fine Gael policy programme that we've had for the last 4 years. In fact, a number of the commitments are commitments that were in the last programme for government that were unfulfilled.
Sinn Féin had a remarkable election result earlier this year, and it now has a formidable team in the Dáil and in the Seanad. It has 37 TDs. How is the party going to ensure that it uses its power and influence to resolve the housing crisis, the price people have to pay for rent, and also house prices?
So the first thing is we want to try and force this government to do the things it says it wants to do, albeit without any firm commitments in the programme. So I think probably the best way to say is we'll be a constructive opposition. We'll hold them to their promises. We'll hold them to account. If and when they fail, we'll expose them. But at all times, we will demonstrate there's a better way of doing things, that there are deliverable, credible alternatives that can be properly funded by a sound government that can deal with these kinds of issues. So, I mean, for example, I'll be tabling legislation next week around a constitutional right to housing. I tabled a piece of legislation at first stage in the Dáil just a week or so ago to protect renters by banning increases in rents for 3 years. All of those things that I think built up a lot of credibility for the party, where we were tabling legislation to deliver meaningful change for people, we're going to continue to do. And crucially, we'll continue to work with other pro-change parties in the opposition. If there's members of the government who want to work with us delivering progressive change, we'll work with them. And again, we'll continue to work with all of those actors outside of the political institutions to continue to build the momentum for change and the mobilisation for change. And I think by doing that, people will see that we're a serious, credible, formidable opposition. But actually, more importantly, we'd be much better if we were leading a government.
Mm-hmm. In a way, Eoin, you're very uniquely placed, given your personal and political history. There was a time you spent time in Belfast City Council. You lived in Belfast. You've got an intimate knowledge of political life in the north, and you're now currently a TD as well, and you have intimate knowledge of the political life of the south. So when we come at these issues, we always look look at them in national terms. So your experience of the north and your experience of the south, how does that work itself out in relation to the issue of housing, for example?
Yeah, and I mean, my interest in housing began in North Belfast. As a councillor, it was the single biggest issue that I had to face, representing folks in Liganeal and Old Park after 2001. And it's continued to be one of, if not the major political issue in that part of the city, if not Belfast overall. And just ironically, when I was elected to the council in South Dublin County Council in 2014, housing was the number one issue there. Mm-hmm. So I suppose it's because of those two sets of experiences. Obviously, the situation in the north is slightly different in the sense that you're dependent for capital spending on funding from Westminster or approval for borrowing from Westminster. You obviously have the housing executive and their unique role. And the inability of the housing executive to deliver social housing directly because of central government policy over many years and the kind of reliance on the approved housing body sector. You also don't have the same level of affordability crisis up here as you do in the south, and homelessness, while a very significant issue, it hasn't got so out of control as it has in the south, although it's an issue that I think needs far more attention north and south. But the core solutions in the book that I outlined work here as much as there. I mean, I met with Karen Killen there. We did a north-south meeting around housing policy. She's obviously the acting minister for communities. And we were discussing the need, for example, for the housing executive to be resourced to get back involved in the direct provision of good quality public housing. People forget that the housing executive in the 70s and 80s built large volumes of really good quality housing all over Belfast and many other parts of the north. And only for political interference from the NIO and the DUP and cuts in funding from Westminster, we have the situation where not enough public housing has been built across the north, and particularly in Belfast and Derry today. So I think those types of solutions are absolutely needed up here. Likewise, greater regulation of the private rental sector is needed. And again, there are some lessons that I think the executive could look to in the south, because while we don't have the strength of regulations that we need in the south, it's still a little bit more advanced in the north. And that rights-based approach to housing has always been a central element of the party's policy, that public services should be delivered on the basis of need, and people should have a right to good quality public services, including housing. So we're trying to ensure through dialogue between myself and Carol, and myself and Deirdre Hardy before she stepped down temporarily, to ensure we have a consistency of approach. But at certain times there'll be a need for variances of tactical initiatives on the ground, just because there are jurisdictional differences. But the core principle has to be the same. Housing is a right, housing is a public good, and the state and its institutions have a responsibility to ensure working people have access to secure and appropriate and affordable housing.
You mentioned the housing executive. I was going to ask you a question about the housing executive and your experience of working in Belfast. I mean, is that a model, the housing executive having the authority to build houses as opposed to looking after its housing estate and managing it rather than building new homes? Would you, is that a model for a solution to this?
Look, the housing executive obviously emerged because of the inability of unionist control councils to fairly distribute housing pre the 1970s. So you had the creation of this body that I suppose was free or less prone to sectarian political influence. Although sectarian political influence still had some role to play.
Sure.
But I think it proved itself in the 70s and 80s to be a competent deliverer of good quality public homes and managing those homes well. So I suppose my view would be the best possible situation today would be for the housing executive to be back involved in the direct delivery of good quality homes. Yeah. That doesn't mean the approved housing body sector doesn't have a role. It absolutely does, north and south, and I've no difficulty with that. But I would like to see direct delivery. I mean, ultimately, we would like to get to a situation where the delivery of public housing is devolved back to your councils. Now, there are still political problems around that. But I'm a big fan, and I talk about him a lot, of Nye Bevan, the Minister for Housing and Health in the post-war Labour Party government in the 1940s and early 50s. And while Nye is remembered for the creation of the National Health Service, and people are familiar with that, people often don't realise he had a central role in the development of a progressive housing policy, one which was very soon abandoned by his Labour Party successors and Conservatives after that. But Nye took a very different approach to housing. He believed for public health care, you need a single centralised national health service. And he's absolutely right. Health is very complex and you need those economies of scale. He took a different view in housing, which is housing is best dealt with at a local level because that's where democratic control and community need can be most closely aligned. And therefore, I'm a big advocate, for example, in the South, of resourcing and funding our local authorities to deliver public housing. Other progressive parties and some unions want a state agency or whatever. I think, just like Nye Bevan did, well-equipped, democratically accountable and needs-driven local authorities are best placed to deliver it. We have a way to go before we get to that in the north, but I think the housing executive is best placed because the approved housing bodies, good and all as they are, they have a limited capacity. And therefore, they should be producing, in addition to a good volume of public housing to meet social and affordable need, by the executive. Now, that requires some work at the executive level in terms of allowing the housing executive to borrow. There are some constraints from Westminster, and they all have to be worked through. But certainly the party's view at the moment is that would be the best mechanism to deliver the kind of volume of public housing that's needed. So again, it's the same principle north and south, but slightly different delivery mechanisms. Big problem in the north, of course, is the funding constraints. Yes. If Sinn Féin were in government in the south, we could raise the level of borrowing or raise the level of taxes that are required. Until those powers are devolved to the Assembly, you're still always, I suppose, chasing a government in Westminster for those additional resources, and that does unfortunately limit the capacity of an executive to deliver as much as certainly Sinn Féin would like it to deliver.
In the introduction to your book Home by Paul Mason, he said that it was important to separate the market for housing from the market for financial assets. Could you just explain what that concept means? Sure.
Probably the best way to think about it is before those changes in mortgage finance that I talked about in the 80s, before they took place, by and large, what did banks do with their money? They invested in the real economy. They invested in businesses that created jobs, that produced stuff that people bought and sold. And that was why, I suppose, during that period of time, the investment that financial institutions made was very productive, and it led to job growth and increased productivity and increased welfare among larger sections of the population, particularly from the post-war period up until the late 1970s. What happens in the 80s is because banks are increasingly allowed to invest in property, and particularly land. Land is the key here. Then banks had a decision to make, which is a safer bet, investing in a company that may or may not succeed, or buying land. Because the value of land is never going away. It's always going to be there. So what happened very dramatically over the 80s and 90s is you had this dramatic shift of financial investment away from the productive real economy, companies, jobs, production, and into speculation in land. And that's what drove that asset price inflation and house price inflation. And during the Celtic Tiger era, of course, it was banks lending to individual households and lending far too much money that ultimately many of those households weren't able to sustain. What happened after the crash was central banks restricted lending to households. That's a good thing. That means people can't borrow money that they can't pay back. But you had this thing called quantitative easing, where basically large amounts of new money was printed and given to financial investment vehicles in the hope that they would invest in the real economy and jobs. But what do? They invested in the safer bet of land. And all over the globalized world, particularly in big cities, all of these financial institutions are investing heavily in real estate, in commercial buildings and apartment buildings. We're seeing this in Dublin, we're seeing it in New York and London, etc. So we're getting a new property bubble led by the real estate investment trust and the equity investors. And that's what Paul is talking about. And that has a very destructive impact on the economy. One, because it makes housing unaffordable. Two, because it creates bubbles that will eventually burst. And three, because all of that money isn't being invested where it's needed, in good quality public services or good quality employment for people to produce good quality things for people to buy and sell, whether they're goods or services. So by separating housing from speculative market-led investment, you're able to deliver affordability. And that's why under Sinn Féin's proposals, growing the non-market section of our housing system, the public housing system, is absolutely key. There will still be private housing and private investment, etc. But that's a separate thing. But also it's why we need to have a conversation about rethinking the free movement of credit, so it can just go wherever the hell it wants. Like, money can move at speeds that humans can't. Money can go to places that humans can't under international law. And that's has positives, but it also has huge risks. And therefore, delivering housing on the basis of need through public housing and trying to find better ways for international finance to be redirected into the productive economy, I think they're two of the big challenges for any progressive government if we want to try and avoid the kind of casino economy economics that dominated pretty much from the end of the 80s, early 90s, right up until the crash in 2008.
Your book is clearly solution-focused in terms of the dealing with the housing issue and resolving it. But you also make the point in the early stages of the book about the language that's to be used to describe the problem. And you go through a number of adjectives to describe the problem, and you land on the word dysfunctional to describe the housing system itself. And I was just wondering, because you also, in the same chapter, talk about a functional system. And so between the dysfunctional and the functional system, how would you describe the functional system? Obviously we understand the dysfunctional system as it exists now.
Yeah, because I think what's important about, for me, language matters. And how you diagnose a problem determines the way in which you think about the solutions. But dysfunctional is about the relationships, because housing isn't just a physical roof over your head. It's also about the relationship that you have with where you live, with the people you live with the wider community, and with your society, with the people who build houses and buy houses and lend money and whatnot. So I suppose at the moment, all of those relationships are broken. You have investment trusts, for example, making huge profits by charging enormous rent or property prices, in part because they're paying enormous sums of money to buy the land and borrow the finance. You have working people whose relationships, not just with the housing system, but the relationships with themselves. Because if you're cramming people into overcrowded accommodation, that has implications for people's relationships with one another, etc. That creates all sorts of dysfunction in the relationship between workers and their employers, because workers need more money because they can't pay the rent. They have to put in wage claims. Small and medium-sized businesses, the lifeblood of our economy, north and south, can't afford those wage claims. So all of those kind of relationships are damaged because of our system. So a functional system is one that tries to repair those. And at the core of that has to be affordability. People have to be able to access secure, appropriate and affordable accommodation. And that's not just good for them. That then starts to repair all of those other damaged or broken relationships that are in the system. So, every time I hear people talk about the housing market, as if the housing market is this thing, we have a housing system. That housing system is in the main put in place by rules and regulations, or the failure of governments to put in place rules and regulations. And inside that system, there is a bit which is the market. But we need to look at the system overall. And I think if you start to take that more holistic view and start to say, how can we fix the broken relationships between the different parts of that system with the objective of giving people secure and affordable accommodation, you can start to design a housing system that works. The test is, do people have access to good quality, affordable homes? And there are bits of what that system looks like, which we did well in the past. Our housing system was never perfect by any stretch of the imagination. There's bits that other jurisdictions around the world today are doing better. So let's, be a magpie and take all the stuff that works from our own past and from other countries, and let's then improve and adapt that and design a system that works for us in the here and now. No system will be perfect. No book and no one party has all the solutions. So let's also be constantly relooking and rethinking and open to changing and improving it. And that's why that idea of kind of participative planning is really important, because too often people who don't live in public housing, people who didn't grow up in public housing, people whose children will never live in public housing make all those decisions. Whereas what we want is the communities who we represent and the communities from which we come from, who are ultimately going to populate these communities and these houses, put them at the centre of it, empower them and skill them to be able to be decision makers in how their communities are designed, built, managed and maintained. And I think we'll have a much better, not just housing system, but a much better city, a much better country and a much better life for increasing numbers of people.
Okay, well, look, I think on that positive note, I'd just like to thank you on behalf of Féile for coming to Belfast today in the middle of the COVID crisis to talk to us about housing and the solutions that you've offered to resolve the housing problems.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Jim.